Well, welcome to the Baylor Conversation Series. I'm President Linda Livingstone, and we are back today to continue our discussion on racial healing and justice. For our last conversation series on June 24th, we had over 400 unique viewers to the conversation and had over 70 questions submitted. And we didn't get to anywhere near all of those 2 weeks ago. So we're certainly going to try to answer as many of those today as we can. Before I reintroduce our panel, who did just a wonderful job in the conversation a couple of weeks ago, we have had some significant developments at Baylor on the topic of racial healing and justice, and I want to just remind you of what those have been. First, the Baylor Board of Regents unanimously passed a resolution denouncing racism and declaring the university must be a place of belonging for all of our students, faculty, staff, alumni, and friends, including those of color. Second, the board acknowledged Baylor's historical ties to racism, slavery, and the Confederacy through our forefathers and early leaders, our Baptist faith, and the location of our first campus in Washington County. And finally, the board established the Commission on Historic Representations to look further into areas such as statues, buildings, namings, and other campus artifacts, as well as to propose ways that we can tell the complete history of Baylor more effectively. We named this 26-member commission on Monday and look forward to their work, which will begin later this month and continue through the fall semester. So with that introduction, here today to assist me again are our esteemed faculty members. Please join me in welcoming back Dr. Moody-Ramirez, Chair of the Department of Journalism, Public Relations, and New Media, a former journalist and noted author on race. Dr. Garrett, a professor in the Department of English with expertise in entertainment, pop culture, and race. And Malcolm Foley, a former student regent, doctoral candidate in religion, director of discipleship at Mosaic Church Waco, and a new senior advisor to the president on equity and campus engagement. So welcome back to our panelists. Appreciate you joining me again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
Well, to start, I would like to ask each of you for your feedback on these recent steps that the Board of Regents has initiated, as well as to get some of your general thoughts over what's happened over the past couple of weeks since we last visited. Given that Dr. Moody-Ramirez and Mr. Foley are actually on the Commission for Historic Campus Representation, I'm going to start with the two of you, so we'll let Dr. Garrett close us out on this question. Okay. So Dr. Moody-Ramirez, you might start us off.
Sure. Well, it's kind of a cliche, but I personally think that it's true. If you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. So I actually think that it's a great idea. And I am a Baylor alumna twice. I have 2 degrees from Baylor. So personally, I am very excited about this commission because I want to see Baylor do well and thrive in all areas, including race relations. And I am very glad that God has placed it in our hearts, the desire to make Baylor more equitable and inclusive at this point in history. Our leaders have decided to go above and beyond the remarkable education institution that Baylor already is. We're already known for being remarkable, but now we're going to go from good to great. We want to have a place where students can come, they can study, they can grow, and they can become better citizens. And so I think that Baylor is already making a positive difference in the lives of students and also in the Central Texas community in general. But this just adds another layer. This is kind of the icing on the cake. So now when our faculty and students look to us for guidance on issues relating to diversity and inclusions, they won't receive mixed messages from us. They won't tell us, well, you need to put your money where your mouth is. You're not doing what you're saying that you're doing. They will truly be able to say, yes, Baylor is practicing what they preach. It is my personal hope that we give students the wisdom and the skills that they need to not only succeed, but to go out into the world, a world that is very diverse, to go out and be able to make a difference and to be a leader in a world that's very diverse, because they're going to be the future. They are the future. So they're going to be the supervisors. They're going to be the managers. They're going to be working with a very diverse staff different companies. So they need to know how to work with different groups. But I think we just need to continue to pray for Baylor. We need to pray for our leaders, pray for our visionaries. And we need to ask that God continues to give them the wisdom and the integrity to lead Baylor in a manner that is pleasing in his sight. And I do believe that this is pleasing in God's sight. And right now is actually a very, very good time to complete Baylor's history as it relates to slavery. And it makes me very proud as an individual and as an African-American woman that Baylor is making the effort to do more in this area. And actually many people in the Waco community have come up to me, or well, actually since we're dealing with COVID-19, they haven't been able to tell me personally, but they have posted it on my Facebook page, they have emailed me, and they have congratulated me for being assigned to the committee or appointed to the committee. And they have told me that they're very proud of Baylor. They are glad that Baylor is finally doing something of this nature. So one of my favorite scripture references is, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And that's from Philippians 4:13. And this passage is a witness to the importance of having faith in God. And I believe that if he brought us to it, if he brought us to this point, then he will bring us through it. So we just must keep this in mind as we embark on this task that he has placed before us. It's not going to be easy, but we can do it.
Oh, thank you for those thoughts. Mr. Foley, what are your reflections on the commission and what's been going on the last couple of weeks?
Yeah, so with all my comments today, I'm going to take the my favorite theologian, John Calvin, has a phrase that he would refer to his own work, and it's brevitas et facilitas, so brevity and simplicity. So I hope that I can be brief and clear. So I'm looking forward to serving on this commission, and particularly looking at the ways that we narrate our own history. First of all, I mean, I'm deeply proud of the moves that Baylor's making as an institution, particularly its leadership, particularly the board, you, Madam President, just deeply proud. And as I indicated last time, you know, it's often the case that we see individual impulses amplified at the institutional level. So we're used to seeing kind of individual remorselessness, a kind of unwillingness to reckon with our own to reckon with our own sin, and we often just see that kind of amplified at the institutional level. But this move, these moves that Baylor has been making over the last few weeks, I think exemplify the fact that Baylor is seeking to begin this hard work of self-interrogation, and we'll see where that path leads us. You know, this commission is on kind of historical representation, so it's a focus on these symbols of power, but there are also conversations around interrogating our system, interrogating our campus culture, interrogating campus climate. You know, because we want to be able to get to a place where, you know, where the complaints of the Dear Baylor Instagram account, where we know, like we see those things and we know them and our hearts are broken by them, and we want to be able to build a Baylor where those things are actually unconscionable. You know, we want to have kind of a culture in which casual white supremacy and misogyny are recognized as kind of the evils they are, and it's going to be a painful reckoning. Purgatorial removal of sin is always painful, but one thing is clear is that we have to prioritize the well-being of our faculty, students and staff, and the centrality of our Christian mission. That we're to be a beacon of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Yes, individually, but also we're figuring out what it means for us to do that institutionally, and it's going to be a journey to figure out precisely how that looks. But it's very encouraging to see that's the direction that we're moving in.
No, thank you. Any further reflections, Dr. Garrett?
There actually are a couple of things that come to mind, and first I just want to say I'm so grateful that we've begun this process. As you know, President Livingston, this is something that's been on my heart for a while because of some of the research that I've been doing and some of the processes that I've been observing around the country. And I'm so grateful that we're doing it, and grateful to my friends and colleagues here for being a part of that work. One thing I want to say very quickly, just about the last 2 weeks, we used the phrase tipping point 2 weeks ago about how we have come to this place where the great horror has led to a place of hope, where now so many people are understanding the story of race in America in a different way, that things that we never thought were possible have become possible. And I just want to draw attention to two quick things culturally. Within a span of days, the state of Mississippi voted on and removed their flag, which contained the Confederate battle flag. Like, if you had told me I would live to 108 years old, I would never have expected that to happen. And then the other huge sort of cultural thing that's happened in the last 2 weeks that I want to draw to everybody's attention. The owner of the Washington NFL franchise in Washington, D.C. Had said years ago, and he had said, you may put this in capital letters, we will never change the name of this team. And this week, because of pressure from the NFL itself, because of pressure from sponsors and advertisers, and because of the way that we are shifting as a culture at this moment, they are considering and moving toward a new name for that franchise. And these are huge cultural shifts, part of a number of cultural shifts that we mentioned last week. So what I would say in terms of the commission that's been set up, the one thing that I would want to invite my colleagues to do is to think about our highest values, and to think not just about where we have failed, but also where we have attained the things that we aspire to. And I hope that this, this quest for how Baylor has represented itself racially during the historical record is not going to be mired simply in the antebellum past, because there are plenty of more modern instances where the history of Baylor pushes against civil rights and against racial justice, and we have not always been on the right side of that. So, you know, I want those things to come to light so that we can repent of them and be in conversation about how to move forward. And then I also want to celebrate the places where Baylor has lived up to its highest values. And the thing that I would put forward here that I hope the commission will think about is that in 1916, the lynching of Jesse Washington took place in Waco, not far from where you're sitting this morning, President Livingston. 10 to 16,000 Wacoans came out and watched a man tortured and set on fire, and they collected his body parts as souvenirs. And it's one of the most horrifying racial events in American history. And the acting president of Baylor wrote the national magazine, The Nation, and unilaterally condemned it in a time when this was a really hard stance to take, even for a religious person. He spoke up on Baylor's behalf and said, we want to be on the right side of history. And we have not always been, but when we live up to our highest values, that becomes an aspirational thing for us to think about as well.
Oh, it's interesting that you talk about that part of Baylor's history, because we do have some folks that are fearful that we intend to change Baylor's history. And that is certainly not the intent of the commission. The commission's intent is really to tell a more complete history of Baylor, a fuller story about the history of Baylor that's consistent with our Christian mission. And we hope that it will be in meaningful ways help us redeem our history and ultimately share it more fully with the Baylor community, with others more broadly. There was an article in the Waco Tribune Herald about the commission, and there was a professor from Trinity University that was quoted, and I loved his quote because I think it captures in many ways what we're trying to do. And this is what he said. He said, context is everything, and their placement, being statues and plaques, as part of historical display. The original intentions behind their placement and who that person was in the grand scheme of things all matter. To me, the conversation is more important than desecrating something or saying something should stay because it's part of history. How do we find a way to bring people together? How can we use these monuments to engage in a conversation deep in the throes of what the university is, wants to be, and hopes to be? And I think that's the intent. How do we come together through this, understand our history better, and then think about what that means about what we need to be and what we need to do as we move forward. Now, with that said, I want us to turn to some of the questions that we got last time we were together and were unable to answer given the time constraints that we had. And so those
Mhm.
questions, I've kind of organized them along the four thematic areas. First, our country's state of affairs. Second, the responsibility of the church in all of this. Third, the role of Baylor and higher education more broadly. And then finally, very specifically about Baylor's campus climate. So we'll have some time for new questions from today's audience towards the end, but we'll work through some of these questions from last time as we begin today. So let's start off with our country's state of affairs. Many colleges, universities, and other organizations started a process of exploring their history and potential ties to racism and slavery several years ago. Dr. Garrett, I know you have connections with Georgetown and other entities as well that have done this. What does such a process look like, and what are some of the lessons you've seen organizations learn as they've gone through these processes?
Well, I really like what Mr. Foley was saying earlier about how we bring these things out into the light so that we can start repenting of them and moving forward, and the healing becomes possible. In the process of the last book that I wrote, I had a number of conversations with people at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And the experience that they had to repent of is really pretty horrific. In the 19th century, they sold 272 slaves who were owned by the Jesuit brothers in Maryland and sold them to work in the Louisiana cotton fields. The most horrific experience. I mean, slavery is horrific just start to finish, but this is the worst possible experience that slaves could have had. And they felt like this was one of their great moral failings as an institution. And they had originally rationalized it in economic terms, which is how slavery is always rationalized by people who want to rationalize it, because everybody was doing it, and this was a necessary thing, but it was a horrific human rights violation. And so what they realized a couple of years ago is this is the great sin of our institution. We need to investigate this, explore this, repent of it, and enter into conversation with the descendants of those 272 slaves to talk about how we can begin moving towards some sort of justice and equity, and how this institution can not just repent, but can be an agent of reconciliation, which we know from 2 Corinthians is what we are called to do. And so their process was long and it was powerful. They explored all of these dark aspects of their history. They came back together and acknowledged them, because part of what we have to do is tell the truth about who we've been as institutions, as a nation. They offered public worship. There was a litany of repentance and reconciliation in which members of the Jesuit community and members of the Descendants came together as a part of this. And then they entered into some concrete actions, some of them symbolic and some of them very practical. So like the symbolic ones, the two presidents of Georgetown who presided over this slave sale, the buildings that were named for them were renamed to reflect this action, and to try and to draw more of a just conclusion to this. And Georgetown continues in conversation about how they can repair the damage that they did to these families as a result of what they did. And so it's a really powerful thing. And I used the word highest values a while ago. And that, I think, is what has driven all of these institutions that I talk to. We want to live up to what we're called to be, and we have not always done that. And because we haven't always done that, we need to bring these things out into the light, talk about them, repent of them publicly, and begin this arduous process of conversation about how we can make things right.
I appreciate you sharing that. And I just especially think that those of us that are Christian institutions that are working through these issues, in some ways we have an even higher calling for how we think about and address these issues than even secular institutions might. Now such a unique time in our history. We have so many kind of national and global issues and crises that we're dealing with all at the same time. I don't think anybody could ever looked ahead even 6 months ago and said, oh my gosh, we're going to be in the middle of a pandemic. We're heading into a rather divisive election period. we've got all of these issues around racism and a national reckoning with that we're dealing with. You could go on and on with the list of issues that we're dealing with at a very deep and significant level. So I'm going to ask this question of Mr. Foley. Do you see these as interrelated? Do you think it was predictable that these would come to peak at more or less the same time? Why is this all happening at the same time? Now, the pandemic, we probably could never have predicted that. Some of these other things maybe so, but talk a little bit about that confluence of all of those things together and what that means for us.
Yeah, there's somebody who tweeted out that who would have thought that we would be going through like the Spanish flu, the Great Depression, and the Civil Rights Movement all in the same year. So I think the most important thing to know about these crises though is that the only one that's new is the novel coronavirus. And so racism and white supremacy have required a reckoning for centuries. American leadership has often been divisive, and particularly Black people in this country particularly know that there's never been a time in which kind of local, state, and national leaders haven't said racist things or perpetuated racist ideas or enacted racist policies. Our current situation, there are different things to think about in our current situation, but the danger has has been pervasive kind of forever. And so yeah, I do think they're interrelated. I also think that we've also seen that interrelation for a while, and there have been a number of activists and folks who have noted that. When Martin Luther King summarized kind of the three evils that we have to deal with, it's racism, economic exploitation, and militarism. And the way that he talked about those, there was always interplay. There was always interplay between them. And so when we think about any number of kind of political and social issues, it's impossible to predict kind of how they'll work together. But they're never kind of, they can be distinguished, but they can't be fully extricated from one another. And so that means that even when we have these kinds of conversations, like this is a conversation that's specifically about issues of race, and we're focused in that way. But that's not to say that other issues which are distinguishable from this, it doesn't mean that they can be fully extricated from it. And so that's something that's important to think to keep in mind, even as we have this very kind of specific conversation.
Oh, I agree, and we even know that the pandemic disproportionately affects our communities of color in this country and probably around the world, and so then that actually adds to the other tensions that we see, obviously.
Exactly, and one of the and then one of the reasons for that is then because, well, it's also like we're dealing with a healthcare system that disproportionately leaves people of color to die. There's a great book on this called Medical Apartheid that deals with specifically the history of medicine as experimentation on Black men and women. How a number of the developments of modern medicine depended on that practice, and it just the ways in which these things are weaved into our society. That's something that I said a lot of us aren't aware of it, but when we see it, we start to see it. We start to see it everywhere. So.
Well, Dr. Moody-Ramirez, you're kind of an expert in social media. It's one of the areas you study a lot and teach a lot about. So this is one of the questions we got last time. How should we handle and respond to powerful personalities and commentaries on social media that would suggest white supremacy and systemic racism no longer exist in the United States?
Okay, and this is actually something that we're seeing more of, and as Mr. Foley stated, a lot of this has been going on for a long time, but now that we're dealing with COVID-19, people are at home, some of them are working from home, they're spending more time on social media, they're able to express themselves more, so we are seeing more opinions. We're seeing opinions like we saw in 2016 after the election. But I would say that there's not one way to handle all personalities. It really depends on the person and the type of relationship that you have with that person. On social media, we don't usually know everyone that we're friends with on a certain platform, but some of them we do. Some of them we know from high school. So we know in high school they were the class clown, or we know that they were serious. And so we're going to respond differently if they were the class clown, because we know, well, maybe they're just being sarcastic, or maybe, you know, they said that, but they didn't really mean it. So I think your response is going to be different. However, when your friends see their post, your friends, they are like, oh, why are you putting up with that? Why are you letting that person post on your page? Why are you letting them dominate? So those are some of the things that I have to think about. When people post that type of content on my page, sometimes now I will email them and say, hey, we need to chat offline. Let's talk about this in an email, or let's talk about this, you know, in a chat. But we have to remember that even Jesus put himself in uncomfortable positions, and he fellowshipped with people that other people thought were offensive. So we can't say that I'm going to unfriend everybody who disagrees with me. And so that's why I continue the dialogue. I continue to talk to people who disagree with me, and people who post what some of my friends consider offensive. And they frequently tell me, why don't you just unfriend that person? I wouldn't put up with that. But I try to listen to other viewpoints. I try to see things from different perspectives. And this is really a skill that I learned as a journalist. You always have, as a journalist, you have to be a good listener. You have to be objective. And something I also learned as a journalist is there is always two sides to a story. So I'm always trying to say, okay, I'm going to listen to your side, but I also know that there's another side. However, when people become abusive, or they share content that's harmful, racist, or, you know, misinformation, false information, that's when I will tune out, or I will unfriend them, because hate speech is not tolerated. That's when you have to draw the line. And I'm also aware that there are trolls on social media platforms, and their sole purpose is to make you upset, so that you will say something that could possibly lose your job. You maybe, curse them out on social media, and then end up having President Livingstone call you and say, Mia, why did you say that?
I would never do that. Never.
I've gotten that call. It's fine.
Robin would call me. But so you have to be very careful. There are people that, you know, maybe they were bullies in high school, or maybe they were pranksters. And so they sit around thinking, what can I do to tick her off? Or what would make her go crazy on social media? And then possibly she will lose her job. So you have to think about that. And people that are trying to make you angry, those are the people that you might think about unfriending, because at that point, that's your livelihood. And if somebody is going to try to make you lose your job, then at that point, you do need to unfriend them. I have learned to ignore some people. I've learned to ask them to email me if they want to follow up on something. Just email me on Facebook. Don't email me on my Baylor account. Email me on my Facebook account. But a lot of times they're just seeking extra attention. They're seeking validation. Sometimes they feel guilty for their viewpoints. Sometimes they know their viewpoints are not right. Sometimes they just need prayer and forgiveness. You know, I'm a Black woman, so they want to hear from me that their viewpoints are okay. They already know that their viewpoints are not okay, but they want me to validate them and let them, you know, tell them, oh, you know, it's going to be okay. You're all right as a person. You know, sometimes they will tell me they have these racist viewpoints, but they go to a predominantly African-American church. But I'm wondering, well, you go to an African-American church, but you feel this way. You know, those two things don't line up.
Yeah.
But, you know, on my Facebook page, the content runs the gamut, but people are very passionate about what they believe in. So I try to be patient. I try to understand their viewpoints, but I also let them know my point of view, and that I stand behind my point of view. I also let them know that we can disagree, and we can still love each other, unless their disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. And that's a quote from James Baldwin. And I think that's very important. when they start to cross the line and they start to share hate speech, that's when I disconnect.
I don't know, Dr. Garrett or Mr. Foley, if you have any additional wisdom or advice for folks
Well,
around this question.
I'll jump in very quickly. I'm interacting with all of you on social media, so this is kind of fun to talk about. But I came from a very, like, a small town background, and so when you look at my social media feeds, particularly Facebook, I have got people that I went to high school with, elementary school with, as well as people that I went to seminary with, and people that are professional connections now. And there is this incredible diversity. And one of the things that social media can give us is it gives us the opportunity to get out of our gated communities, because we are so often divided into gatherings of people who look like us and think like us and worship like us and love like us, that it is rare in our lives that we have the opportunity for diversity. And I love the way that Dr. Moody-Ramirez kind of laid out some of the ground rules for how we interact. But I just came off an interview about the book on race and film that just came out, and it was with an Episcopal priest, and he talked about, we are in the forgiveness business. And I try and go as far as I can in understanding why people have these beliefs, because they've been politicized and weaponized, and are widely disseminated in different media. And even though I can disagree with them and find them difficult, I also try and understand where they come from. And the sort of pastoral response that I often have is, I see that you feel really strongly about this. Can we talk about this? Because we are very clearly on different sides of this issue. So there is something in the power of love that I think is valuable, but I think there's also something in what Dr. Moody-Ramirez says that, because at the point where people are shutting off dialogue and saying, this is the hate that I want to spew out into the universe, I think it's absolutely okay to say, I don't choose to be a part of that.
Mm-hmm.
That's good. We need those love responses. And when we think of, I want to hone in on the part of the question where we're dealing with people who are suggesting that these things no longer exist. There are also others who insist that these things no longer exist. And when we come into contact with those situations, I think it's just important for us to remember that the social power of an individual has no bearing on the truth of their statements. And so someone telling me that I have opportunities that I don't actually have doesn't make those opportunities appear. Now, actually actively working for the removal of the obstacles in my path, now that's definitely helpful. But if we're looking at a situation, I know this may be a little bit controversial, but if we're looking at a situation where someone is kind of constantly denying someone's experience of the world and telling them essentially that they're crazy, sowing seeds of doubt to make people doubt their memory, their perception, and their judgment, that's a form of psychological manipulation, and it's called gaslighting. And it's part of this abuse that Dr. Moody-Ramirez was talking about. And so there are a number of socially powerful white and black voices that will tell us that white supremacy no longer exists. But those numbers are few, and they're few because those individuals have to give an account of when and how these things went away. And quite frankly, it's highly unlikely to me that something that took centuries to build could fade in 50 to 60 years of haphazard resistance. And so we're not done, brothers and sisters, as much as we might want to be. And so when you hear people say that there is no problem, but you know that problem exists, please continue to struggle against it, because you're not alone. You're not alone in that struggle.
Yes. That's a good response, because I don't even get to the part of systematic racism no longer exists in the United States. I'm not going to even argue with them about that, because we know that exists. So that would be stupid for me to sit there and argue with somebody about that.
Well, that's the thing. Well, and
I mean, why would you argue about that? It's obvious that exists, but I mean, it's just other things that they will say, like, why do you have Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement? It's going to be other things like that. Why do we have that? So that's what you're going to be arguing about.
Yeah.
That's what you would be arguing about instead. You know, so little like that is what you would be arguing about.
Yeah.
A rich discussion on that particular topic. We're going to shift gears a little bit and actually talk about a topic that's just so much easier than that one, and it's the responsibility of the church in all this, okay?
Yeah, the church. That's great.
So here's the question that was submitted that I will share with you. Perhaps I am just misunderstanding, but I do not understand the part in the title of the conversation series with elevating conversations on race. As Christians are not we all brothers under Christ? Why should we divide ourselves with regard to skin color when we have Christ bringing us together? Of course, sinful behavior, being acts of racism in this case, should be talked about. However, in the title, it is simply race, not racism. Why should we, as brothers under Christ, talk or care about race? So, Mr. Foley, I'm going to let you take that one first.
Well, all right, it's juicy. It's juicy now. So, there are like there are about like 6 things in this question that I really want to address. But I don't want to talk for an hour. This isn't just, you know, questions with Malcolm. So, so I want to parse out. Let's parse out a few categories briefly that are present in this question. First of all, a full-throated affirmation that yes, if we're in Christ has bound us together by His Spirit, and that's a connection and a union that's closer than anything that we can ever imagine. Union with Christ is the most glorious of all realities, and it necessarily should manifest itself in us being members one of another, as Paul says in Romans 12:4-5. The question, quote, why should we divide ourselves with regard to skin color when we have Christ bringing us together? That's a good question. We shouldn't, but we have. And American churches continue to live in that reality. And so why should we talk or care about race? Well, because racialization is a reality that deeply affects the lives of our brothers and sisters, and it's not a biological reality. It's a profoundly powerful social reality, like money. The only reason that this piece of paper has meaning is because we've all agreed that it does. Similarly with race, the reason why it has power is because we've given it that power, and denying its existence or denying our need to kind of talk about it, it doesn't make it weaker. All it does is it allows the systems that work in order to uphold it to continue to function without resistance. And so race is a social construction whose tendrils are long and whose talons are deep in the American psyche, and is present in the church. Because if you ask why American churches are still segregated, and I want to do, this will be a very, very, very quick history deal. But you've got to go back to the beginning of particularly historically Black churches, because in early America you have a number of multi-ethnic, we'll say multi-ethnic churches, but it's clear that white folks are in charge, and actually that's still true today, that you have multi-ethnic churches in that category, but that's a separate conversation. But some, like Richard Allen, among others, recognized that their worship was being actively suppressed. And so Black Baptists and Methodists, they would often go to their white leadership and say, hey, we're being actively suppressed, like, can we go start our own church? And instead of responding with repentance, their white leadership said, okay, yeah, go do your own thing, we'll send somebody to supervise you. And that's the short story as to why Black churches exist. It's not because of some fabricated idea of Black supremacy or something like that, but rather because the people of God have wanted to worship freely. And so Black churches are still necessary and still beautiful images of the gospel as cultural oases in a world that's still pervaded by white supremacy. And so talking and caring about race are then necessary because talking and caring about social realities are necessary for us to be able to love our neighbors well. This is a note from a few weeks ago. For you to love me well, I want you to see me. I want you to see me for all of who I am. And so it's going to include race. Not talking about it doesn't make it go away.
Yeah.
So for Dr. Garrett, how might leaders of predominantly, if not solely, white churches begin or initiate these conversations surrounding race and then advocate for change in the fight against racism?
I've been having a lot of these conversations with white pastors and priests lately, and thanks be to God for that. Dr. King said that the 11 o'clock worship hour was the most segregated hour in America. And what I'm hearing from a lot of these people is we want to do the right thing, but we don't know any people of color. They don't come to our church, and so I think there are a couple of things that are really important for white churches, particularly that have an intention to be on the right side, not just of the history that's going to be written, but of the gospel. That intention to be in conversation and learning and moving and growing and part of this work of racial reconciliation is, I think, a very big thing. And in many of our churches, it's going to mean preaching and teaching the full gospel. So like I grew up in a church where there was never any conversation about institutional sin. It was always personal sin. We don't drink, smoke, or chew, or go with the girls that do. And while that kind of repentance matters, there are all sorts of sins that also matter. And the Bible is a history of the tension between people talking about personal morality and people talking about justice. And that goes all the way back into the Hebrew Bible, and Jesus brings that conversation into the present when he initiates his ministry and says, I have read this thing about justice in the world, and this is what I have come to do. And so that would be a huge change for a lot of our churches, to simply preach the entire gospel. The other thing that I think is really important for white churches, particularly for people who don't have a set of conversation partners or connections with people of color, there are all sorts of different ways that they can learn about the lives of people of color. And if we are going to say that Black lives matter, then we have to learn about Black lives. And so part of what I've been doing for the last 4 years is this process of bringing people together around films on race. And there are lots of different things you can do. You can read books, you can read novels, you can watch films, but I think there's this very powerful sense that you can enter into the conversation, even if you don't feel like you know a lot, by exposing yourself to the lives of people who are not exactly like you. And whether that's a dramatic depiction or James Baldwin's autobiography or Maya Angelou's biography, or Dr. King's sermons, there's this very powerful sense that we can educate ourselves as a white church, even if we don't feel like we know what to do next. And then after the education, we can start talking about what's next. How do we make the next steps? But as Mr. Foley and I have had some conversation on social media in the last week or so, and basically we have this very strong agreement that recognizing that we need to do something is only the first step. And it is a big step, and it is, as we said, a tipping point. But where do we go from here? So once we start to learn about Black lives, once we start to preach the full gospel, once we start living in to the questions of justice and injustice, then we can move forward as a church and start redeeming the history of racism that sort of trails us like baggage.
Well, it's not in a church setting. I oftentimes, when I meet with our freshmen as they come to campus, one of the things I encourage them to do is that you're in one of the richest, most diverse environments you will ever be in, both in terms of the makeup of the student body and the faculty, but also just the intellectual climate that you're going to be in and the classes you could be exposed to, the speakers you could be exposed to. And I tell them you should meet people you would never meet before, take classes you would never take, hear speakers you wouldn't normally listen to, because it is one place where you have this real rich diversity of people and thought that frankly, most of them, no matter what background they come from, haven't been exposed to before. So it is one of the great benefits and joys of being on a college campus that our students can take advantage of. And frankly, we need to encourage them, I think, even more than we do to take advantage of that rich diversity that they experience.
Dr. Livingston, can I add something
Sure.
quickly? So, and this continues in the kind of guidance for predominantly, if not solely, white churches. One of the books that's been, and this is kind of from my own experience of serving in predominantly white churches, especially predominantly white evangelical churches. Probably one of the most important things that I learned from Michael Emerson and Christian Smith's book Divided by Faith is the fact that there is what they call the white evangelical toolkit, which is to say there's a kind of lens through which many see any of the things that we read or things like that. And the three kind of tools in the toolbox are accountable free will individualism. So basically this idea that people are where they are because of the choices that they've made. Relationalism, which is to say that the main way to solve problems is just with personal relationships. And then the third one is anti-structuralism. This idea that if we focus on structures, that moves us away from the individual. And those kind of frameworks can often kind of distort the way that we interpret the world around them. So for example, that accountable free will individualism. Yes, our choices are important, but it's also important to know that I am where I am, not just because of the choices that I've made, but I'm where I am because I've made the choices that I've made in a system that rewards particular choices in particular ways and punishes other choices in other ways. And it could, and the person making those choices can actually change the outcome. And so when that then becomes the framework, it's much more than just, hey, this person made this choice that necessarily led to this outcome. There's also thinking through, okay, there's a context in which all of these choices take place. When it comes to relationalism, yes, my individual relationships can change things, but I also have to know about myself that I'm going to want to surround myself with people who agree with me, and so this is what leads to the black friend phenomenon, that you find a black friend who will affirm you and you've done your job. No, this is a work of extending networks, not just kind of one-on-one deals. And then with the anti-structuralism point, no, it can be the case that not only that not only are there issues at the individual level, but looking at structures doesn't necessarily mean that you move your eyes entirely away from the individual. It just means that you recognize that there's more than just the individual that has influence on this particular situation. So I think it's important that when we, even when we interact with the literature that we interact with and things like that, that we understand that there are probably lenses through which we're seeing the world, and sometimes those lenses can distort.
Absolutely. So this is kind of our last question on kind of the role of the church in these issues before we transition to talking more about higher education. But this one I'll direct to Dr. Moody-Ramirez. So what is the role of the church in promoting white supremacy, specifically with the images and materials, stained glass windows, paintings, and other artifacts that show Jesus as white?
Okay. This is an interesting question, and I think I have to provide some context for the discussion first. George, as you all know, George Floyd died on May 25th, and this has served as an impetus for the removal of statues of historical figures such as Saul Ross, Christopher Columbus, and George Washington. These have either been vandalized or taken down by protesters or authorities. So during this period, people began to ask, well, is nothing sacred? What's next? Are they going to vandalize statues of Jesus? Are they going to destroy those statues next? And so there's this very well-known activist named Shaun King And Sean King commented on his Twitter account a few weeks ago that statues and monuments that depict Jesus as white are culturally unacceptable in 2020, and they should be destroyed. Since that time, King has received about 500 death threats from people who would rather see him dead than remove statues of white Jesus. So that is a quote. So I think this is probably where this particular question originated. They were referring to this incident. So to me personally, while on the surface, these images of Jesus depicted as white are not, they may not necessarily be connected to white supremacy. When you take a closer look, they might be. Jesus likely had the appearance of people who typically lived in the Middle East during this period. In our society, but in our society, he's generally depicted as white. When you go to churches and you look at stained glass and maybe some statues, some Bibles, he is often depicted as white. Growing up in my household, we did not have any pictures of Jesus. And the churches that I attended, we did not have any stained glass windows depicting Jesus. So I was not aware of that. And in my Bible, Jesus is not depicted as a white person. And so, but in our society, Jesus actually is depicted as white. And some people say that this is to make it easier for people to relate to, because some people might not be able to relate to a brown-skinned version of Christ. This is what has been said on social media platforms. People who typically, the people who make the stained glass windows and who created the statues, they were generally Anglo, and they were making those statues in their image. And since they are Anglo, they made those statues Anglo because that's who they could identify with. And so personally, maybe when they were making those statues, they weren't doing it out of hatred. They weren't doing it because they were part of the KKK. So I don't see it as being necessarily connected to white supremacy, but I think maybe we need to take a second look because once you know better, you're supposed to do better. So now we're actually in a different period. And so if you're worshiping an image of Jesus who makes you feel more comfortable with yourself, rather than the more accurate depiction of Jesus who has brown skin and woolly hair, then maybe you need to think about why that makes you feel better. And you also need to think about what would make everyone in general feel more comfortable. Would they rather see an accurate depiction of Jesus, or would they rather see a depiction of Jesus that makes one group feel more comfortable? And so I just think that, maybe there's some options going forward that we can think about. Maybe think about having depictions that are more accurate, maybe doing away with these altogether, disposing of them, or just, just reconsidering it altogether. But I think going forward, only history will tell.
A thoughtful response, and certainly a challenging issue with it.
It is challenging. It's a tough issue. When I saw that question, and I had to think about it long and hard. That's a tough question.
That's funny because I mean I really only thought about it for a second. In the sense that
sometimes my mouth will get me in trouble.
No, that's real. When I saw that, I just just my first thought was that there's no need for white Jesus. Like people need Jesus. Everybody needs Jesus, but there's no need for white Jesus. I'm reformed. I'm reformed theologically, so I'm already generally kind of anti-representations of Jesus. But there's a great book on this reality called The Color of Christ, by Edward Bloom and Paul Harvey, and two prominent historians. And in it, they kind of expertly frame the ways in which kind of white depictions of Christ, both physically and theologically, that they're used to sanctify genocide of indigenous populations, it's used to justify the oppression of Black people, and it's used to justify imperial expansion. And so if that's the end result of such historically inaccurate representations of my Savior. I say, let's be rid of those, because instead I want to know the Lord as he truly is, the eternal Son of God made man, the Son of God who became flesh, and not just abstract flesh, but the flesh of a first century brown-skinned Palestinian Jew who willingly gave up his life for me, who was also lynched by a mob, and who was also executed by the state. All of those things are true of the Lord that we serve. And actually, that historical picture that we get from the scriptures is much more beautiful than white Jesus. And so if we're gonna have Jesus, whom we need, let's have the actual Jesus. That's my thing. So I would add on. I mean, Sean King may say, go be done with white Jesus. I will add to that. People need to know the real Jesus. So that's how I deal with that question.
So I grew up in a church that you only saw pictures of white Jesus. Grew up in a small church in Oklahoma, in rural Oklahoma, and when I was about 12, my family spent a summer in Israel. My dad was coaching over there, and so then you're in Israel and you're visiting all of the biblical locations. And I think it was in that summer that all of a sudden it like dawned on me that Jesus wasn't actually white, because no one there was except us, right?
Yeah.
And it was like this huge light bulb went on, and it's like, oh, well, of course. Why would I ever have thought he was white? And so, and it was just this kind of really stark, moment of realization, because I was physically in the location around people from that same background and heritage. So it is an important conversation to have, and for us to really think about who Jesus really was on many levels. Certainly not just.
And you turned out okay. But you turned out okay.
Well, I appreciate that, Mia. Appreciate it. Well, let's shift gears and talk a little bit about Baylor and higher education and promoting racial healing and justice. So, Dr. Garrett, you're going to get this first question. Does Baylor, being a Southern institution, give us a special or maybe unique voice when it comes to speaking on this issue of racism? Not saying that racism or systemic racism is only in the South, but is there something about our sort of location and history that maybe gives us a certain responsibility or a unique position to speak to this?
Yeah, I think it absolutely does. There's a saying in the South, who are your people? And what that means is, who can I talk to? Who will understand me? Who knows my experience? And so for us as a historically Baptist institution, as a Southern institution, as a Christian institution, there are things that we can say and audiences that we can reach, particularly on an issue like this. And what I've noticed personally over the last couple of months, as I've been talking to white people about white privilege, and I'm not saying this is a good thing, but it is a human thing, because they are my people, they are more willing to listen to me than they are to some of the voices of people of color, who would make them put up walls, who would make them feel defensive, the whole white fragility thing that we have been talking about for the last couple of weeks. And so I think what Baylor's situation allows us to do is to speak in a really powerful way into the conversation. And of course, what we are always saying is that the world needs a Baylor. But I think the world needs a Baylor at this moment in a very particular way, because we are in this space where people who have not been thinking about race are now thinking about race, and where our work and our witness can actually be an important movement in helping people to accept the system that they've been a part of, and to think about next steps in moving toward justice. And so I think that there is this very real sense that people will listen to us in ways that they might not listen to Yale or Stanford or Iowa, because we are right here in the middle of the mix.
Appreciate that. So we're running kind of short on time, so I'm going to skip through a few of our questions and try to get to the end for some of them. So I'm going to go to this one. How do you respond to those scholars who are just as versed, if not more so, in American history and civil rights, who are not in any way ignorant of the issues at hand, yet disagree with your assessment of American systemic racism and your proposed solutions? Do you allow for honest and righteous disagreement, So I know Dr. Moody-Ramirez, you might start with that one.
Yeah, I'll start with that one because I get that question a lot. Many of my colleagues ask me, do you get fed up with explaining systemic racism, connections to police brutality, and why the Black Lives Matter movement is important? And I do. Sometimes I get fed up with it, but I am a teacher. I come from a long line of teachers. So I guess that's why I continue to do it, because I feel like if I can just teach one person, then I've made a difference. So I don't give up. So if I'm asked to do something like this, I would ask these scholars to bring their facts, and then I would bring my facts, and let's talk with some parameters. I would ask them to have an open mind, and I would ask them to be honest. In return, I would do the same thing, and then we would put all our facts on the table, and I would tell them that statistics don't lie. Once slaves were freed, their slave owners were compensated for their lost income of slaves, like their slaves were cattle. Former slaves who were not allowed to learn, they weren't allowed to go to school. They sent them out. They had to go find a way to, make a living. They didn't have a network. There were some white people who helped them. There were some free Black people who helped them. But there were so many hurdles in place to keep Black people back, to keep them from making progress. That's systemic racism that you're talking about. Separate but equal was definitely separate but unequal. The schools were not equal. Books were torn up. The school buildings were in horrible shape. Water fountains, we had to drink out of colored water fountains. Black men sent to prison systems. I don't know if you've heard of the documentary 13th, that tells you all about it. So, I mean, if they can't look at that and know that American systemic racism is real, that means that they're not being honest with themselves. And I don't care how smart they are, how intelligent they are, if they can't look at those statistics and say that it exists, then there's got to be something wrong with them, because it's there in black and white. And even after desegregation, people continue to try to keep Black people down. They continue to hate Black people for whatever reason. And even to this day, some people view Black people through that same lens. And that's why we have police brutality. And I know, and I'm not saying that all police officers are mean or bad. Not all of them go into police academy with the intent to kill a Black person, but you do have some. That's their intention. They go in with the idea that, yes, I am going to kill me a Black person. That's sad, but that's true. Because they are still living through that lens that Black people are bad. Black people are animals. Black people are not human. So that is what Black people have had to deal with over these years. And so these are the facts, and these are the facts that I would share with that person who's saying that this is not true. But you know what? I wouldn't spend too much time trying to convince them, because if they look at these facts and they're still unsure that it's real, then there would have to be something that's innately wrong with them, because it's there in black and white.
Yeah.
Dr. Garrett, would you like to add any thoughts to those of Dr. Moody-Ramirez?
Well, I would just affirm that reliance on statistics. Racism is not an opinion. It's a fact. You were talking earlier about the fact that people of color are much more susceptible to the coronavirus and to all of the effects of it, and are forced into the workplace to take care of their families at rates that white people are not. Recently, we discovered that there has been no change in the last 50 years in the level of wealth relative to white and Black families. Black families continue to have 1/10 the average wealth of white families, and it's not because they're not working hard. It's not because they're not trying to improve themselves. But the most important thing, I think, just going back to what Dr. Moody-Ramirez was saying about Black Lives Matter and about institutional violence, Black men have a 1 in 1,000 chance of being killed by a police officer. And again, it's not that police officers are necessarily bad, but if someone told me that I had a 1 in 1,000 chance of dying from something, I would not do that thing. Whatever that thing was taking a shower, eating olives, I mean, whatever it is. But, you know, Mr. Foley, my friend, Mr. Van Newkirk from the Atlantic Monthly, people who are treasures in terms of the thought and ideas that they bring into our culture, they do not have the option of avoiding that statistic.
Right.
And so that I think is what I would say. I mean, I am willing to engage in conversation with everyone. And as I was saying earlier, I am absolutely willing to love because that's what I'm called to do. But at the end of the day, racism is a simple fact of our culture. And to deny it is not something that I can sit quietly by and watch.
And there's one thing, just a very quick thing I want to note is that data doesn't speak for itself. Data only has meaning insofar as we interpret it. And so when we see something like the statistic that Black men are overrepresented in our prison population, you can come to that data, which is true, and come away from it with the conclusion, oh, clearly Black men just commit more crimes. You could do that if it's part of your plausibility structure that you actually think that that's something that you can say about a particular racial group. If you realize that, wait a minute, I shouldn't actually be saying that about anyone, then you start to ask the question, okay, well, why does the prison population look that way? Then you start looking into prosecutorial practices. Then you start looking into arrest records. Then you start looking at kind of how district attorneys choose who to prosecute and things like that. Because that's when you start asking the questions of, okay, someone ending up in jail is actually the end of a long process. Let's look at these points along this process, as opposed to just jumping straight to, oh, well, they're in prison, they must be criminals. This is just the way that Black men are. But it's just so much easier. It's just so much easier for us to take that route. And we're just, and we like to go with the easy. We just like to go with the easy conclusion. And one of the things that, back to this point of disagreement, people, like, it's like, you can be honest, you can be honestly wrong. You can't be righteously wrong, but you can be honest, but you can be honestly wrong. And we can disagree on ways forward. We're obviously going to disagree on ways forward, but when it comes to kind of the recognition of the issue, this is the last quick thing. I think of Zacchaeus. When Jesus encountered Zacchaeus, it ended with Zacchaeus saying, behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. And so as a rich tax collector who had gathered his wealth on the backs of others. And then we look at the history of Black people in this country as Dr. Moody-Ramirez recounted. It's a history of wage theft and property theft that some people have tallied it up to trillions of dollars. The question is not whether that debt is there. The question is, that ought not be a question. The question is, what do we do about it? And an option that's not on the table is, well, let's just wipe the slate clean. No, it's something we've actually got to do something about it. And so let's have the conversation on what to do about it, rather than, well, is it actually a thing? Yes, it's a thing. Let's figure out what to do about it.
Well, let's transition and talk about that as it relates to the Baylor climate, and what do we kind of do about that in the context of the Baylor climate. And so one of the questions we got 2 weeks ago, and I'm going to ask this question of myself, how does Baylor plan to incorporate these conversations about race into the classroom? And obviously an important question for us as we think about how we sort of broadly educate our students to function appropriately in the diverse world we're in. So I just wanted to mention a couple of things. One, our faculty in the College of Arts and Sciences redesigned our core curriculum a couple of years ago. That curriculum had not been redesigned for, several decades. It was in need of revision. But one of the reasons the faculty felt it needed to be revised was because there was a sense that it inadequately addressed diversity in deep and important ways. And so that new core, and we're going into the second year of its implementation this fall, so it's very new, has 6 core courses in English, history, religion, and political science. And each of those courses has been redesigned so that there are contributions from people from many different cultural backgrounds engaged in telling a fuller, more complete story on whatever discipline that might be a part of. These courses also have common readers. And with that redesign, the authors for those common readers come from very diverse backgrounds, ethnically, racially, in terms of gender. And then the required course in political science helps students understand how the Constitution has changed as the country has become more diverse. It also focuses on how those changes in the Constitution impact many different cultures in the United States. And race figures very prominently in those conversations. We're going to continue to evaluate that as it's implemented to say, are we really doing enough, and are we doing the right things to integrate issues of diversity and race appropriately into that new curriculum? The College of Arts and Sciences, which composes about half of our campus community in terms of students and faculty and staff. So it is a huge part of the campus. They're going to set up a diversity committee, and one of the things that committee is going to look at is opportunities to develop concentrations with a strong commitment to diversity. The new curriculum provides a lot more, the new core provides a lot more flexibility for students, so it does provide the opportunity to develop concentrations that we really didn't have the flexibility to create in the past. And then the other thing I would mention, we have a new student experience course that all of our freshmen take when they come in the fall. And one of the goals of that course is around cultural humility, which I believe is really critical in understanding diversity and being able to engage with folks that come from different backgrounds and experiences, and also is really a prerequisite for civil discourse. And so the faculty are developing specific lessons that can enable instructors to directly discuss issues of race and diversity, utilizing resources, some of them from outside, but certainly some that our faculty are creating themselves. A portion of that's going to include biblical content regarding God's desire for his people and the multi-ethnic, multiracial nature of the church. So in some very core areas where really all of our students will be touched, we are seeing that really integrated in fully with the curriculum. I know we have many faculty across campus in more specialized courses that touch on these things. And Dr. Garrett, I know you've referenced your film class and others, but you might speak a little bit more to what you're seeing in terms of curriculum.
Well, one of the things that we pride ourselves on at Baylor is a great liberal arts education. And there are some disciplines that lend themselves much more clearly to this kind of conversation about race and diversity. And I'm lucky enough to be kind of at the nexus of all of those things. For 30 years, 31, starting this fall, that has been a part of every conversation I've had in every literature class, every film class. And that happens in other places. Well, you talked about political science, we talk about religion. In many of the humanities courses, there is this very strong sense that we can have a powerful discussion about this. And I want to echo what you were saying about the core curriculum. This fall, I'll be teaching the American Literary Cultures class for the first time in a couple of years. And this is a version of the sophomore lit class that I've been teaching since I came to Baylor. And I am incredibly excited about that. The circumstances are not exactly the way we had wanted them. This is not the way that I typically teach. But there is this opportunity for me to introduce an incredible amount of diversity into the classroom. And I know from these decades of experience that this is often one of the formative things that happens to Baylor students, is that they're exposed to experiences that are unlike their own. They learn to think and to perceive a different way of being in the world. And they walk out of that classroom at the end of the semester, and we hope we walk out of our degree program as changed people. People more willing to be involved in the work of justice and the work of diversity. I'm so excited, like I'm sort of almost foaming at the mouth to be thinking about teaching again this fall.
Right.
I'm sure our students will be better for being in your class this fall in those conversations. So
Very interesting.
One of the other questions we received, how can Baylor's students, staff, and faculty encourage and support greater inclusivity and diversity in hiring and leadership, particularly in higher levels of leadership? And what additional steps will Baylor or should Baylor be taking in the future? So Dr. Moody-Ramirez, you can start, and then I'll turn it to Mr. Foley from there.
I think we just probably I know that we have programs where we have mentors for faculty, but just maybe have more mentors. You can never have too many mentors. Maybe help more with research efforts. Faculty support in the areas of research and writing for conference and journal articles and research grants. I think that would be good. Faculty of color who write race-related articles, they tend to have a hard time finding a place to have those articles published. I know when I was on the tenure track for the first 3 or 4 years, I had a hard time having my articles published until I added social media, the lens of social media to my research, and then I started getting some acceptance letters. So if they could maybe offer more help to faculty of color in that area, more assistance in research and help in finding a place for their research. And as far as students, just continue to do what we're doing. I think we're doing a good job, but just do more of it. Just make sure students of color feel welcomed and included. Continue to offer programming through multicultural affairs, but also look at the inclusion of students of color and other organizations and facilities on campus. And we need to make sure that our faculty and staff are trained in difficult dialogues and microaggressions. I understand that we are working on that. We have some ideas in place. I'm going to be teaching a workshop in the fall on microaggressions because that is something that students talk about, that they experience microaggressions on campus. There's a hashtag that's called Dear Baylor that Mr. Foley mentioned earlier, and it's on Instagram, and it indicates that Baylor students, like all students across the country, they're frequently called on to answer questions about the Black experience, or they're stereotyped as being less intelligent. But that also crosses over to faculty. Faculty feel like they're stereotyped as being the token, or they're made to feel that their research is not as valuable, or maybe they feel like they have to work twice as hard to be acknowledged. So those are some of the things that not only the students feel, but also faculty. So that also needs to be addressed. Faculty of color, they want to make sure that their research is also appreciated, because sometimes their research is appreciated in other circles. And when they go to conferences, they can be very well known, but at Baylor, they're not as well known, because at Baylor, they don't really know the value of that research. So I would like to see more done in that area as well.
No, that's a very helpful suggestion. Mr. Foley, we've actually brought you into a role where you're going to help us answer this question more fully. So share your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it just begins with it being an active priority. I mean, the fact that Black students can come through Baylor without ever having a Black professor is heartbreaking to me. I think similarly of my Latino, Asian, and Indigenous brothers and sisters. And that's the representation point. Students need to be able to see people who look like them in spaces as an opportunity to even to see themselves in those spaces. It can be a self-perpetuating thing. When you see a professor who looks like you, suddenly professor is now added to your list of things like, yes. I can do this. Yeah. And there's mentorship that can help guide you through the process of like a PhD and things like that, because those are incredibly daunting to someone who's never come into contact with them before. They're daunting to people who are going through them. So there's also the content. There's also the content deal, which is what Dr. Moody-Ramirez was talking about, because scholars of different backgrounds may have different research questions, and it's often the case that because the majority culture is the heads of these journals and things like that, certain questions are marginalized as particular people are. And so, but our histories and our methods they're not to be siloed. Black history is American history. Black church history is the best of American church history, really. And so these are things to be celebrated, but that only happens through intentional work. So intentional hiring, intentional shaping of interview questions, intentional recruiting, all these things have to be intentional, because inertia is so much in favor of majority culture. It's gonna be really weird to kind of intentionally fight that flow. But that's the process that we have to be engaging in.
We've got a really interesting question from a staff member that I'm going to direct to Dr. Garrett. It says, as a white staff member, I am hoping that this conversation series will spark conversations at the division and departmental levels to make sure that my colleagues are feeling fully supported and not otherized by our ignorance and my ignorance or unrecognized bias, whether intentional or truly unintentional. How can we ensure that in trying to take genuine steps forward, we are not making our Black colleagues feel singled out or made to feel uncomfortable in this process? I really appreciate this very thoughtful question of concern as someone truly wants to learn and do better.
Yeah, I am so grateful for that question, and for all of the white people who want to do better. I mean, that's such an exciting movement. I have two thoughts about that, and I would love to hear what our colleagues have to say about it. My friend Yolanda Pierce, who's the Dean of the Divinity School at Howard University, has talked about how it is unfair to expect people of color to carry the weight of doing this work. And the analogy that I make, I don't know if it's a great analogy, but it's sort of what I've got for this afternoon. It is kind of like asking the victims of an assault not only to testify about the harm that has been done to them, but also to prosecute the crime. And so one of the things that I think we as white colleagues have to do is we have to recognize our own culpability, our own necessity in being a part of this process. And then the second thing, just as somebody who's been involved in the church and involved in academia, the two institutions to which I've given my life are institutions that will take everything that you are willing to give them. And that does not necessarily mean good things. And so I know from conversations with some of my colleagues who are people of color that oftentimes they are asked to do too much in terms of this work. And we definitely want to make sure that we represent and have incredibly diverse composition on commissions and committees. But at the end of the year, when we have to tally up the things that we have done in terms of research and teaching and service, I think our colleagues who are people of color often are asked to do too much in terms of service. And they often give those things gladly because they know that this is an important way of moving forward as an institution. But I would ask our administration, our regents, all of the people who have to be thinking about this to be cognizant of what we are asking our colleagues of color to do, and making sure that we as white colleagues are pulling our weight.
Yeah, I appreciate those thoughts. And I know many of our administrators and deans think very carefully about those things, but it's certainly a challenge. And I've been at 3 different universities, and you really struggle with that everywhere, because you do want representation and diverse voices, but you do know how much of a burden it can be when you have a small population of faculty and staff of color. We're going to go to a couple of questions from the audience so that because we're actually getting pretty close to 5 o'clock here, so we want to be respectful of everyone's time. So this is the first one. It says, I am wondering how institutions such as Christian universities and churches can open spaces for Black and Brown unity so that discussions of race in the U.S. do not perpetuate the usual Black-white binary of racial tension in the United States. Using the language of people of color, but not addressing things that are peculiarly brown, Latinx, for example, seems to limit the scope of conversations about race. Can you talk about Black and Brown unity? Who would like to start with that question?
Good.
Malcolm, would you like to start?
Yes.
Yes.
I can see he's ready to jump on that question.
No, I mean, I'm thinking. So this is the thing. I mean, like there are, especially in us thinking about kind of us as an institution. There's anti-blackness, and there's a long history. There's a long kind of national history of anti-blackness, but then there's also a long history of anti-Latino, Latina actions and thought. If you look at the map of kind of the map of lynchings in this country from like 1830 to now, when you look at particularly southern Texas, the lynching of Latino and Latina folks it's terrifying. And that's not just an isolated case. It's not just an isolated case of racial violence. It speaks to narratives that circulate, and systems that keep that remove people's opportunities. So so it's important that when we have this discussion, and like I said, this is why kind of the work of distinguishing and I mean the work of distinguishing is important. Focusing on resistance to anti-blackness is not like, that's not the end, because the fact is we have found very creative ways to oppress different people, and so because of that, we have to be specific about kind of what the issues we have are and how we're specifically addressing those issues. And so I think the question asker brings up a very important point, that's a kind of, there are ways in which Black and brown people are experiencing the same thing, but then there are also ways in which they're experiencing different things, and we have to be willing to dig deep into that. So that's important. That's important to keep in mind.
So the last question is really for me to respond to. It says, some of my colleagues are very concerned about the fact that the Office of Equity has gone from 3 professionals to 1 in the last 3 months. At a time like this, it is not good that the office that is supposed to investigate incidents in addition to providing training on equity, diversity, inclusion issues is essentially decimated. Great question, and a fair question in the circumstances. And so a couple things I would say. One, we are working very hard to sort of restaff that program and certainly grow it back to the number of staffing that it needs to support the campus that we have. And in addition, while we're in that process, we are using external resources to help us ensure that as we get, as issues are brought to that office, and as you might expect, they've had many more issues brought to the office over the last couple of months than we normally have seen. And I think this has actually been a good thing, because it shows us that people are willing to raise these issues, whether it's what you've seen on the Dear Baylor account, whether it's people responding to things they've seen on social media or sharing experiences they've had on campus. It's important that we're aware of these and they're being shared with our equity office. And so we have staff in that office and external resources that are reviewing all of those issues that are brought to them so that we can understand them and address them in appropriate ways. So we're deeply committed to certainly ensuring that that office has the staffing that it needs, but certainly some of that will be internal and then some of it external, particularly at a time right now where we have a lot of issues that office is looking at and seeking to address. So this has been a wonderful conversation again today with our panel. I do want to mention an upcoming conversation that's going to take place on July 13th, which is this coming Monday evening from 6 to 7:30 p.m. Our Baylor Alumni Black Alliance and the Baylor Alumni Latino Group are hosting a panel discussion. It's going to include 2 of our Baylor regents, Michael McFarland and Renee Maciel, who will be joining that panel. I will be on the panel. Dr. Moody-Ramirez is going to actually flip tables with me and ask me questions, and she's going to moderate the panel. And then Congressman Colin Allred, who's a Baylor alum as well, is going to be joining that group. So it'll be a different flavor of conversation than we've had in our last 2, but I encourage everyone to join that on Monday evening at 6 p.m. So I want to thank our three panelists once again. You all have been wonderful. What a rich conversation and such an important topic that we've got to continue to put at the forefront of what we're doing, certainly at Baylor, but in our communities and around the country. And I just want to conclude that as we leave, let us pray to take the instruction found in Micah 6:8 to heart, to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our Lord. So thank you for joining us today, and have a wonderful evening.